Hi, everybody. I'm here today with Katharine Evans. Welcome, Katharine. So nice to see you today.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Oh my gosh, I'm excited to talk about the employee value proposition. So I'm Samantha Bateman with Integria Consulting, and Katharine is a partner at Boreala Management, and we're going to be talking about the EVP. So let's get started. Katharine, what is an EVP? Just baseline, educate us.
In its very simple form, I would say, is that essentially it's what an employer is offering employees in return for their contribution, i.e. in their roles. There's many different definitions, as you can well imagine, but that is the simplest form or the simplest definition that I was able to find around the EVP.
Okay, so what makes up an EVP then? Can you share a little bit of what the components are? What's the recipe to an employee value proposition?
Well, the truth is it really depends on the organization. There are some fundamental categories, if you'd like, or main themes that are pretty consistent across the different definitions. But essentially the five main components, and these are in my words after having looked at different organizations, is of course there's the whole element of rewards. So this is the tangible salary, bonuses, etc. Then there is a component about benefits, and so that will look differently according to different organizations, but this will include time off, sick leave, and other such items. Of course, then you have everything to do with career. So in some organizations, many organizations, this is about professional development, career progression. The next area is everything about the organization. So this is sort of the work environment or the work context. So this could be colleagues, the actual location of the business. Do you work from home or do you work remotely, etc. And last but not least is culture and values. So this is everything to do about the organizational culture, the values, respect, collaboration, etc. So those are the five main components. Of course, as you can imagine, there are different ways of expressing that according to the research, but essentially those are the main pillars.
So when we see an employer's values on their website, and then on the back end or internally, there's the intranet or whatever, right, for employees, should those values that organizations are putting out there for the public, should they be the same values that employees are living and breathing, or are there some differences, and why is there a difference?
Well, it's an interesting question, and actually we had that same reflection internally here when we my partners and I bought the business in 2019. We had this conversation because there were organizational values, and of course there's some discussion as well about organizational values, personal values, and how the two connect. I would say that internally and externally, the values should be very similar because it's really about how you conduct yourself and how you want to be seen internally in your organization, but also externally with your clients, with potential candidates, with partners, stakeholders. So for me, they're very much the same. And for me, fundamentally, this is a core piece of the employee value proposition because you could have very strong compensation and benefits, but if the organizational values are not solid, if they're not lived by the organization, this becomes very problematic. So for me, it's a foundational piece when we talk about the EVP.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, with candidates that we've even interviewed, in leadership roles, sometimes they are exiting an organization quietly because they say, the organization isn't demonstrating a level of integrity that I was expecting when I accepted the opportunity. Or when you talk about development, right, with organizations that say we really invest in our people and we're looking to develop them. And if employees are going to their leaders saying, hey, I want to be developed, and then they hire somebody externally for that senior role, the disengagement is almost immediate, right?
Yeah. It's interesting what you're referencing. Another key element for me in this conversation around the EVP is intention. So it's really about being intentional about what you're saying and what you're actually doing. It's also very much about considering your external view and your internal view, and the two definitely connect. So what you're saying externally needs to match what you're doing internally with your employees. The other piece I didn't mention earlier is sort of when I was referencing what an EVP is, when you asked me what an EVP is, it sounded quite transactional. What we're seeing and what we're hearing, and we have been for some time, is that we're moving away from that maybe more traditional definition of EVP, which is a transaction about what you bring versus what I bring, or together what we bring to each other. And we're moving into conversations more around the human-centric approach, values, emotions. This is what, as you referenced it perfectly a few moments ago, this is what candidates are looking for. This is what prospective employees are looking for, and what current employees are looking for. Perhaps the current context is maybe having an impact on that view, but certainly this is something that we've seen in terms of trends.
Yeah, such a great point. So why should employers care about their EVP?
It's really the way that you distinguish yourself. So it's really the way that you can make yourself different. But it's very much about attraction. It's very much also about engagement and retention of your employees. Of course, we can, you talk about those 5 main areas that I was referencing earlier. All of these pieces together really formulate this package that you're essentially offering your employees. And it's very much important for employers to assess each of those different areas and say, okay, well, where are we strong? Where maybe are we missing the mark a little bit? Where do we need to focus our efforts? Especially now, right now in this current context, of course, we're hearing a lot about compensation, we're hearing a lot about benefits, but there are all these other very important pieces that employers need to consider.
Yes, compensation is important, and we see that a lot of people leaving organizations because they're being, lured by more money. But then you have other organizations that might not be paying top dollar, but where the employees feel that the values really mirror their own, and they stay. And it's very tough to get those people out, even possibility of getting a bigger promotion or more money or whatever it is. So, are you seeing that when a well-crafted EVP that's mindful and intentional, are you seeing the retention increase then, and turnover decrease in real time when those values are embedded and lived?
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing that. And we're definitely seeing that, again, it comes back to this notion of intention, but also it's very much about one word that I was reading about last week, which I thought was very interesting. It's all about this experience. So, the EVP is part of this employee experience. And so, of course, if an employee is living, and this is part of the trends that I was mentioning, like if the employee is living this fantastic experience and feels that the organization's values match their own personal values, et cetera, of course, this really does increase the engagement and the retention of this is more and more what employees are looking for. As I said, we were seeing these trends prior to the pandemic. This still continues today. Of course, the current labor shortage has maybe had an impact, as I said, in terms of we're focusing on maybe some very key areas of the EVP when we're looking at what's happening in terms of recruitment. But fundamentally, I think we're still in that trend to a more modern view of the EVP, that it's very much about the human. It's very much about the experience. It's very much about employees as people and not about employees as workers. I read that last week. I thought that was a very interesting way of positioning it. Work and life are not independent. Work is a subset of life. I read that as well last week in an article. I thought that was very, very interesting. So I hope I've answered your question, but we've sort of gone around a little bit.
But you're making me think also about LinkedIn, for example, how outspoken so many people have become in the last year. And I feel like there's this huge backlash against organizations who say one thing and do another. And they can really out themselves. Like, I feel like now organizations have to be more careful than ever before in terms of really living and breathing the values that they're putting forward, right?
Absolutely. What we're also seeing, and it's interesting you mentioned it, is that the employee value proposition and the branding component, like the consumer brand and the employer brand, are kind of coming together in this very interesting moment in time. Is that prospective candidates are looking at an employer brand, yes, but they're also looking at it as a consumer brand. So there's an impact there that goes beyond the employee's experience. It's really about the consumer as well. And yes, I think we're definitely seeing that because it's important. It's important. It's you're building this trust, right? About you're saying this is who I am and this is what I do, and come and join us and this is what you're going to experience. And if it doesn't match up with your expectations, so there are some exceptions, of course, but if that doesn't match up with your expectations, that can be very disappointing. Work is, we spend a lot of time at work, and it's important for us to feel good in that context in order to want to contribute, in order to feel engaged.
Absolutely. So you're bringing up a good point about candidates. We've talked about it as well before, that sometimes job seekers will, share with us that they went to one company, it wasn't what they thought. They went to another company, it wasn't really what they thought because the values didn't match up. So what is it that candidates can do to better dig into the employer EVP before accepting a role and beyond looking at compensation and benefits?
I think it's really about, there's many layers to that question, but I think for me, it's very much about self-awareness for the candidate. Considering really like what is the work environment that's going to work for me? What are the kind of values that I'm looking for? What is over and above compensation and benefits? Like, what is it that I need in order to achieve success and feel good about that success and my contribution to an organization? So there's self-awareness on the candidate side, or a reflection, I should say. And on the employer side, I think it's really about being very clear from the start and really putting into practice their EVP from the moment there's a first contact with the candidate, right up until the offer and then the onboarding and so on and so on. So I think it's very much about self-awareness and clarity and really communicating and making sure that it's a lived experience, if you'd like. That you can tangibly say, oh yes, I did experience that part of the culture. I was able to meet different candidates. So I think it's about self-awareness, and it's also about the candidate asking questions throughout those different stages, asking about these different elements of the EVP. So asking about the culture, asking about maybe it's about the work environment, the type of work, what does a day look like, for example. And as I said, on the employer side, it's really very much about demonstrating that at each stage of the process.
It's making me question when organizations say, we feel that so-and-so is a great culture fit, or we need to move somebody out of the process because, we're not sure that they're the right culture fit. When I hear that, I often wonder if it's about a lack of value alignment, right? In terms of individual is value. But then again, do organizations spend enough time in the interview process to determine if the candidate's values reflect theirs and vice versa, right?
It comes back to, are we asking the right questions?
Yeah.
Ultimately, what is it that works? Because each organization is so different, and it's really about what's working well and what will work well in your organization, and therefore, what are the types of questions that we need to ask? And also, how does that process look? Because in some organizations, it's, phone interviews, phone screen, and then in another organization, it's going to be 2 or 3 case studies. It's really also about that. It's about your practices, and do those practices allow you to sort of get the answers to some of those questions? But fundamentally, are you asking the right questions?
And do you feel that it's more challenging for a large organization to revamp their EVP, or to kind of disassemble it and pull it back together again? Or I guess or do you feel that it's easier for a small organization to kind of get it right from the get-go? Like, what are you feeling?
It's an interesting question. I think that, I don't know if it's easier or harder. I think it's really that with a larger organization, it's just going to be, it's not just going to be, it is going to be a slightly longer process, because part of developing an EVP is first taking stock of what your EVP is today. What are the key elements within your organization? What's happening? What are you doing? What are you saying? And then it's really very much about a data gathering exercise. So asking current employees, really getting the feedback from those members of your team, and also seeking feedback from previous employees. What was working well, what was not working so well, what was their experience. So the scale of it might be larger. Of course, then the next step is, developing the EVP, perhaps there are consultations. So it's really, again, about that scale factor. The implementation brings about certain opportunities, great opportunities to engage with your team, to have conversations, of course. But of course, implementation on a large scale, also brings about certain challenges in terms of communicating, making sure that the different groups are saying the same thing, speaking the same language, or being consistent in the application of the different elements. So that would be my long answer to your question.
How important is it to have a leadership team that's going to hold one another accountable to those values as well? Because I mean, sometimes employees don't feel comfortable to call their leaders out, right? To say, hey, like this is one of our core values and we're not living it. That's not been our experience. So how would you, do you have any advice in terms of, for employers to kind of have those conversations as a leadership team, but then also how can employees kind of raise that with their leaders?
Mm-hmm. There's a simple mechanism which could include surveys, it could include focus groups, for example. But fundamentally, it's very, very important that the senior leadership is very much aligned, that the senior leadership contributes to the exercise, that is very much vocal and sort of the change agents for these type of exercises. If you're looking at making modifications, but even if you're not looking at making modifications, and it's really about ensuring that your EVP is a living thing, senior leadership becomes fundamental, as do your managers, as do different team members. So it's about finding the right mechanisms to make sure that employees or different members of your teams can provide that feedback, whether it's pulse surveys, whether it's exit interviews, whatever the case may be. It's very, very important. But of course, senior leadership, because it really is, it sets the tone for everything that an organization will do. Every type of practice, every decision really should be rooted in the values, the EVP, and really helps define the culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm wondering why those values aren't necessarily put into job descriptions, because I think that would be helpful for a lot of candidates or potential candidates to kind of wean organizations out quickly or to opt in more quickly, right? I'm wondering if there's going to be a trend to kind of, shift that and to talk about that human-centric piece. And this is what we stand for. This is what you can expect from us.
Yeah. So. And this is what it looks like. And this is, we talked about the recruitment process. We talked about also other internal practices that we will have with our current employee group. It's really about seeking their feedback. It's really about listening to what the team is saying and engaging with them and ensuring that we're clear on how our values are experienced and lived. I think I have mentioned this to you, Samantha, but when Lindsay, Tanya, and I, the three partners, bought the business in 2019, we had a major reflection on the mission, vision, where we were going as a new ownership group. And we came back to the values a little bit later on, actually last fall, and we sought feedback from the team and really crafted these values. Many components are very similar to the values that had been already established some time ago, but it was really about recrafting even the wording, even the terminology that was used, and maybe adding on some components that had always been there, but perhaps were not necessarily verbalized as such. So it's interesting, this values conversation, but absolutely it should be front and center, because it comes back to that human piece. It comes back to that experience. Sometimes it's hard to verbalize what it looks like, a value, but actually, is it? I think we have to ask ourselves that question. And how can we make sure to connect all those dots?
I kind of feel like if you're putting out what your values are, then your business decisions almost become easier, because the decisions are flowing through your values, right? And the same thing with your employees. If you're saying, well, we value our employees, but you expect them to work 60, 70 hours a week, or, they don't get that downtime, or you're respecting their time when they're on vacation, and you're still pinging them, or you're not listening to them. Like, I'm overloaded. I need support here. All those things kind of fly in the face of what you say your values are, right? So, yeah.
Exactly. The other piece I think that's important is, when you're thinking about the EVP, you're thinking about values. The other, obviously, key piece is that strategic direction. So all of these elements need to be aligned. Like your EVP should support your strategy. Your values obviously are a fundamental piece of setting the strategy, setting the direction. And again, it comes back to, as you say, like all your business decisions should be connected back to these elements. Are we being consistent? And maybe there are some areas that we say, oh, hang on, this maybe is not as consistent as we would like, or maybe we need to come back to this piece. That's okay too. I think that's part of this process for organizations is coming back to the EVP, coming back to other fundamentals of your business and asking yourself questions, not being afraid to ask the question, to say, maybe I need to rethink this. Is this, are we being consistent? Is the team being consistent, or do we need to come back to this as a group, or with certain individuals, for example?
And not afraid of being challenged by your team or by
Yes.
your employees, right? Around that.
Yes.
I think it just
Yes.
makes things better.
Yes, exactly.
So what are some other things that employers can do to improve their EVP?
Well, fundamentally, it's really about seeking that feedback. And I think it's about asking those questions of your employees. I think taking stock and asking yourself as a leadership group, hard questions sometimes, sometimes it's difficult to ask ourselves those questions, but it's very important. So that's the first step, is really to take stock of what's happening around us and what are we doing and what's in place today. But then very much, seeking the feedback from the team through various mediums, whether it's surveys, focus groups, as I said, could be many different things. And then it's very much about drafting the EVP, the different components, making sure that we're looking at this as a sort of a holistic picture, tying it in with our current practices, our strategy, are we very much aligned, and then communicating it and coming back to it. Also, it's not just, okay, we've done it, tick, here we go, it's on the wall. It's very much about coming back to it and asking ourselves questions again and continuing to seek that feedback.
Yeah, I think if organizations held their leaders accountable more in terms of the turnover and the engagement piece, I think then there would be more questions around, okay, wait, is this leader really living and breathing our values, right? I think if an organization is afraid of losing that leader because maybe they're a great sales leader or they've, been in the organization for a very long time, there's a whole bunch of reasons why they, but then you run the risk of losing your team or having a high turnover, constant turnover, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I would add, what you were saying sort of made me think of something else, is it's perhaps taking the time to rethink about your EVP or consider or assess your EVP is one process in itself, but this is sort of a continual. So it's really about that accountability around, yes, there is, if we're doing a specific exercise around the EVP, that's one thing, but there's accountability throughout the year, there's accountability throughout different moments in time, and it's making sure that those conversations are happening and that those, that accountability sort of permeates what we do as well as an organization, through different processes, through different actions and behavior.
Absolutely. I love that. So what are some industry leaders for EVPs? Like, do you have any off the top that you're thinking?
Yes, I'll just refer to my notes here, but we had pulled up some very interesting EVPs. I'll mention Google. So Google is one that comes out, do cool things that matter. So of course, this is the tagline. Obviously, there are many different components to it, but do cool things that matter. Very, very interesting. Nike, we lead, we invent, we deliver, we use the power of sport to move the world. So you see, one thing about EVPs is that it has to be inspirational, not aspirational. It has to be very inspirational. It has to be in the moment. So as you can see with these taglines, it's very much talking about, what these organizations stand for, and you can read between the lines. And then, of course, there's the definition, as I said, of the different components within the EVP. But those are some of the ones that really stood out for us that we thought were pretty interesting.
That is good. Yeah. And so what are some of the trends that we're seeing in this market? Like, do you want to delve into that a little bit more beyond just the comp?
Well, what we're seeing is that, of course, there has been this movement towards more emotion, values, human focus, human centric, employees as people. As I mentioned earlier, there's also been this movement around this, well-being and holistic aspect of an EVP. So it's less about that transaction; it's more about these different, the different elements that make up this holistic approach. The other thing that I would say is, in terms of very specific elements, there's, obviously telework, there is mental health. There are different components within the EVP itself that we're seeing that employees have been looking for, we're asking questions about, that are being talked about. There is also, progression, development, these pieces that we're seeing more and more, remote work, work-life balance. These have been some of the key elements that have been trending over time, that have been evolving. But of course, the current situation has sort of impacted, or maybe has changed the discourse, and maybe we're focusing on comp and ben because that's what everyone's talking about. But generally speaking, these other trends have been pretty prevalent that we've seen.
And when we look at even hybrid or remote roles, organizations, so there have been a number of organizations that are calling their employees back to the office.
Yeah.
And there's been this sense in some organizations where you say that trust is a value, but how is it that you only trust me if I'm doing the work in front of you, right? So why is the trust not there if I'm working remotely, and probably working more hours than I was before when I was, working at the office? So that I see that as being, questioned a lot by employees and potential.
It comes back to what I was mentioning earlier, which is about intention, about consistency, about saying one thing but then doing something else. And so I think as a leadership group, it's very important to ask ourselves the questions. Okay, if we're going to put in place this practice, and yet we're saying this to our group, our candidates, but our employees, does that match? Are we being consistent? Is that really what we need to do? Are we sending the right message?
Right. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'm looking at the comments. So being intentional seems to be something that's resonated. Here, which is great. If anybody has any questions, pop them in the chat because we have like 3 minutes left. But any challenges of not living up to your EVP that you've seen, like what, cautionary tale maybe that you want to share?
Well, we've seen it in many different organizations. We've read about it, but we've also experienced as individuals throughout our career is, again, this coming back to what's being said and what's being presented to us versus what actually is being lived as an organization. That trust factor of the remote work is a perfect example. It's also about, things like development and mentoring. Those can be great words that you hear, but what does that actually look like? And trust from a perspective of telework is one thing, but there's also trust in the day-to-day, making mistakes. Can I make a mistake? What happens when I make a mistake? What happens if I don't know something? Can I ask a question? So there's all of those pieces. So we've definitely seen, of course, the direct impact is disengagement. And that can really spread very quickly because one decision can be, fundamentally can change the course of your team dynamic, right? A decision to do something or not do something. And so I think that's a piece that's very, very much important and very much linked to the values. So again, it comes back to who we say we are versus what we do in terms of action.
Absolutely. Okay, great. I don't know if we have we do have a question. So Craig is asking, is the EVP statement or document to be supplied to employees at the onboarding? It's a great question.
It's a great question. And it might, depending on the organization, it might be not a document in itself, but it might be various documents. So it might be everything to do from the contract to your policies and the way your policies are written, to the way that your company is presented at the onboarding, to how you conduct your onboarding. We've talked a lot about that in this, when we were all remote, basically, we've talked a lot about, what onboarding looks like in a remote setting. And again, it's like each of those elements kind of combine to make your EVP. Could be your compensation, your salary structures, for example. I think the policies are a big one because that's really where you can really represent your values and you can really demonstrate your values and sort of how you want to run your HR practices, for example, your financial processes. Yeah.
So I'm hearing a lot about alignment and making sure that things are, what you say and what you do. It makes me think too of organizations that have said, diversity is very important to them, but then they have no budget for anybody's diversity, right? No DEIA leader, no budget for them, and then their board is not diverse at all, right?
Yes.
And then it kind of gets people questioning, are you, right? Are you living
Mhm.
your values and what you're putting out there? Catherine, I can't believe it's already half an
I
hour.
know. I just saw the time. I can't believe it.
Thank you so much for your time today. I love
Thank you. Thank you. It was great. It was, we could have gone on for hours, I think, but thank you very much. It was really great to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for educating us today. I really appreciate it. Have a great day,
Thank
everybody.
you. Yes, you too. Thanks. Bye-bye.